And around the world, investors are increasingly allocating capital towards solutions that can transform industries, scale innovation, and accelerate progress toward net zero goals. And Brazil is emerging as a particularly exciting hub where new technologies, natural resources, and entrepreneurial talent are converging to create opportunities with global impact. The next session will explore Brazil's opportunity in climate innovation, highlight key cases drawing international attention, and examine how the country can seize this moment to position itself as a global leader. So I'm happy to introduce our panelists for this session. Julia Sekula, co-founder and CFO at Terradot, Chris Dowd, investor at Collaborative Fund, Marc Mezvinsky, partner at TPG Rise, and Duncan Carlson, principal of Lowercarbon Capital. And moderating this session, we have Bruce Usher, professor and faculty director at the Tamer Institute for Social Enterprise, Climate Change at Columbia Business School. Please welcome you to the stage.
All right, thank you for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite conferences every year to come speak at and moderate a panel. So I'm on the faculty of both the business school and the climate school, the newest school at Columbia University. And in both institutions, I teach the climate finance course. So this particular panel is really relevant to my work and very pleased to moderate it. I'm going to break into sort of two parts. I have a number of questions for the panelists that begin with what are the opportunities in Brazil and perhaps LATAM more generally? And then once we hear about many of the opportunities they're looking at, what are the challenges they're facing in that space and perhaps some recommendations on how to overcome those challenges. So I'm going to ask Julia to start us off here. And my question for you is, you know, your Terradot has sort of this saying that you're founded in Boston, but you launched in Brazil. Why is that? What's the opportunity in Brazil, and why did you launch there?
I will just correct there because we have a strong rivalry with Boston. We're born in Stanford, built in Brazil.
Stanford.
It was too easy. Yeah, so I think from our perspective, and especially everything related to climate is a global challenge, right? And in being a global challenge, I think one of the things that we've always thought about is that you have to optimize the portfolio of solutions in a global way. So it's not enough to say you have a great idea and then simply deploy that idea right next to where you thought about it, right? You have to actually find the region that's going to be best equipped to optimize that solution. And in our case in particular, when we're talking about carbon removal and enhanced rock weathering, we did exactly that. So we looked at globally where would there be the greatest potential for enhanced rock weathering, and quickly came to the conclusion that it was Brazil for a number of reasons. And that drove very specifically our direction to making Brazil our home and building out our projects there today. So a couple of reasons why Brazil stood out for us. First is enhanced rock weathering is effectively a carbon removal process that depends on rocks and rain. I can share more about it later if it's interesting. And so the more it rains, the better for the process. So tropical regions immediately become some of the most important regions in the world for it. The second reason is that Brazil already has an abundance of this rock and an abundance of land, in particular agricultural land, to deploy the solution on. And that makes it very different with some of its, some of the other regions in the tropics where you have this very sophisticated and elaborate infrastructure that is just waiting for science and technology to effectively turn on the carbon removal potential. And finally, we talked earlier in the day about the electric grid. because we work with rocks that require crushing, the fact that the grid is clean means that we don't pay those emissions in the process. Those are kind of the top line reasons. There are many, many other reasons why Brazil is so important, but it was very much from a global optimization angle that we looked at it.
Good. Thank you, Julia. One of the things that always excites me about climate change is a global problem, you know that, but the solutions are so different country to country and region to region. It makes a lot of opportunity for investors. Speaking of investors, let's move over to the investment side. Chris, Collaborative Fund, just tell us a little bit about the fund and more importantly, you know, your thesis on investing in climate solutions in Brazil.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Marc. So Collaborative Fund, we've been around for about 15 years, always investing in companies moving the world forward. We're not an impact fund, but we're dedicated to this thesis that we call the villain test, which is this idea that whether you are strapping yourself to a tree to make sure that a particular construction site is not, or a particular old growth forest is not torn down to in service of a new condominium, or you are the investor in said condominium, we want to find companies and projects that satisfy the needs and aspiration of both of these folks. So these are things that are decarbonizing in nature, that are moving the world forward from a climate perspective, but also have credible unit economics, ability to scale, to really commercialize to the point that you can reach outstanding venture economics. And so that's really what we filter through as we're investing in companies from the earliest stages of pre-seed to Series B and most things in between. We're based here in New York City. We have an office in San Francisco, quite a bit of operations down in Latin America, and have made a number of investments in Brazil over the years.
Thanks for the introduction. Marc, TPG Rise, on many measures, the world's largest impact fund, depending on how you think about impact. But what's the investment thesis of TPG Rise and thoughts on investing in the global south broadly or Brazil more specifically?
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks to the Brazil Climate Summit. By way of background, one of the touchstones of my career is I worked at 3G. So I have a little bit of carioca in me, and I'm grateful to be with old friends. So TPG as a platform, and TPG Rise, and then TPG Rise Climate. So we are call it a little bit more than $250 billion global asset manager. Our impact platform is around 30 billion. And we at TPG Rise Climate manage rough justice around 20 billion. And the mandate is twofold. One is we try to find, identify, work with, and grow the most meaningful companies in the world focused on decarbonization. One, and then two, we have a twin mandate for non-concessionary returns. So we believe that and want to flood capital into the sector, but to flood capital into the sector, you need to be a capitalist. So we're not shy about that. And then additionally, beyond our commercial underwrite, we have an impact underwrite. So at Rise Climate, we have around 100 people. We also have around 25 people who conducts impact underwriting. And the general premise for that is we have a view we call collinearity, namely that by doing good, you can have more of a commercial return. By having an additional commercial return, you can do more good. That has a nice filtering mechanism, both for the team that we're able to recruit, but candidly also for the CEOs and companies who feel mission aligned with us. And so we've built the climate franchise in the past 4 years. We're very lucky to have Hank Paulson as our executive chairman. I think as evidenced by the prior panel and this one, if you ignore policy, you do it at your own peril. Having Hank is helpful in that regard. But at the end of the day, our mission is clear, but quite difficult to accomplish.
Thanks, Mark. And we'll get to challenges like policy and in a moment. And I think a key point you made, $20 billion is an incredibly large amount of capital on climate. But as you point out, it's a drop in the bucket of the trillions that are going to eventually flow into this sector. And your point about being capitalists, I teach in the business school. You're my people, so thank you.
Yeah. No. So our first fund was a little bit more than $7 billion, and I remember sitting down with our LP base as we raised it, and I mean, no kidding aside, I was a little nervous. That seems like a lot to deploy. Candidly, we could have deployed in our first fund 3 times as much, and I can give you a litany of examples of that. It's once you find a scaled opportunity globally, each geography has its own idiosyncrasies. You can deploy it. So the size of the fund, I was nervous about, but I've been proven wrong about those nerves, which our CEO likes because he likes having larger capital pools.
Good thing to be wrong about. All right, Duncan, round us out here on the panel. Tell us about Lowercarbon Capital, a totally different type of fund, a very interesting founder, really interesting story. Tell us a little bit about the thesis of Lowercarbon more broadly on climate and maybe specific to Brazil.
Yeah, sure. Lowercarbon's a fund, multi-billion-dollar fund born out of Lowercase Capital, which was Chris Sacca's early-stage fund. Did really well investing in Uber, Twitter, Instagram, a number of tech companies in the 2008 era. And it was really born out of the idea, similar to a lot of what these guys are talking about, is that the only way to have real impact on climate is to make as much money as possible and show that this is the best investment class, bar none, across early-stage investing. So spun up the fund, and it's really based on a core thesis of better, faster, cleaner, and cheaper is the future, and that there is, I would almost say, endless opportunities across the entire economy for new businesses, new technologies to come in and just disrupt things and make us, our LPs, founders, and society a lot of money and fundamentally better. Our core thesis is, and I say core, but it's probably as broad as you can get, is generally decarbonization, full stack. So everything from clean cement and clean iron technologies to software for trading waste and recyclables to AI management and energy generation like fusion. A second piece of our core investment thesis is carbon removal, and that the world will be moving towards systems of managing carbon in the appropriate ways. And so we have a dedicated strategy in that space. And then third, really core to this, is what we call buying more time. And that's essentially the idea that a lot of this stuff isn't going to happen fast enough to not have massive impacts on the lives that we live, the lives that everyone in the world lives. And so technologies that buy us that time, that help us build resilience, we're really excited about, and that's a core piece of the portfolio.
All right, thanks, Jay. Let's round out the opportunity set with a question back to you, Duncan. You'd hinted at, but you didn't tell me when we talked earlier about, you said there's an overlooked sector in Brazil that could be the next climate tech unicorn.
Yeah,
what is that?
A lot of times I get this question, and then I help lead our carbon removal fund, and so I talk a lot about, I'll be talking to investors, and I'll say, yeah, like no one is thinking about carbon removal in the right ways. I think in this audience, everyone knows about carbon removal. You know about incredible companies that we've backed like Momback, and so I'm not going to spend time there. I think the one that we're really particularly excited about in the Brazilian economy and where we see many opportunities across a few different industries is waste. And this is a little bit of a sweet spot for me. I worked in the waste industry in the US for quite a few years. I think waste in Brazil has some fundamental massive opportunities, and we're really excited about that. There's high fragmentation. There's just literal management issues of waste not getting to where it needs to go. You have companies looking for solutions and actively going out and trying to figure out solutions in-house. And you have new technology and new infrastructure coming online at a rapid clip, whether it's landfills or recycling centers or other ways of managing that waste. And so we feel that waste is one of those areas where there's, I think there could very well be a climate tech unicorn coming out of Brazil in that space. And it's not just on the municipal side. I think we see that as being massive. We backed a company called Musa that's kind of building the connective layer between businesses, landfills, recycling centers, and making sure waste gets to where it needs to go. But it's all aspects of waste. It's agricultural waste for maybe it's biochar or being fed into feedstock for biofuels. Could be mining waste. I think that is one of those specific areas that we're really excited about in Brazil.
Not a lot of people get excited about mining waste. I'm glad you do. That's good. No, thanks for you want to.
I was going to say we do.
Waste. Yeah, you guys do too for the weathering. Absolutely. Thanks for the introduction, the opportunity, and you're seeing it from a number of different angles. Good starting point. Challenges. Let's get the hard stuff here. And Marc, given that your fund is, has sort of the biggest view of what's going on globally, can you speak to specific challenges in Brazil or LATAM that you've experienced and your thoughts on that?
For us as a fund, there's a few factors. One is, where is this scaled opportunity, right? This is a little bit of the think big. And so finding an opportunity where we can deploy, let's call it 400 to 800 million per opportunity, that narrows the aperture. We need the ecosystem of folks in the earlier stage to get companies to that point, but that almost by definition kind of narrows the pool. That said, we do have a huge portfolio of companies who subsequently can invest in Brazil. So we do that all the time. So that is just a scale question that's relevant. Beyond our actual climate fund, we have a global South fund. So Brazil it's almost unavoidable, right? I mean, beyond the sequestration, you have 35x subsequent sequestration through the Amazon. So we spend a non-trivial amount of time there. Abstracting, there's a bit of a relative value assessment. So we have, you need to have local people on the ground to operate in Brazil. I've learned that having transacted there many times. So finding those resources, finding that globally, and then putting on a relative framework is also a threshold. And when Selic is over 10 and cost of capital for local financing becomes an additional relative framework, then it feeds into a capitalist allocation. So one is scale, one is cost of capital. I know Jonathan Goldberg was talking about that capital stack a little earlier. And then additionally is where are the pathways strongest? So the obvious policy noise we're going to see, but getting in front of those pathways is a challenge. Candidly, I think what's happening, for example, in Japan right now is quite interesting and will be second derivative relevant for Brazil. But that global network of opportunity sets, seeing through it, having the resources, people financing and lining it up, that's the challenge. If you can unlock it, that's the opportunity. And finding it at scale is where we get very interested.
So you mentioned on the ground, and I'm gonna get to Chris to talk about your experience on the ground and experience you've had there. But just before I get to you, Chris, because I want to dig into this a little deeper, Julia, first of all, congratulations. You recently closed a Series A, $54 million. That's a terrific raise, terrific round. But my understanding is there was only one Brazilian investor in that round, I think Follower. What were the challenges to raising capital in Brazil, in the ground, in the market there? What was the challenge to getting investors outside of Brazil into Brazil, in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think from the perspective of capital from the outside, actually, we were positively overwhelmed with how well people were looking at the region when you look at it from a climate perspective, right? So making the argument that the best place to deploy this solution is in Brazil, when I'd listed earlier some of the reasons. I think it becomes very easy to understand why those factors in particular bring you a lower cost, higher scale solution, right? Which is ultimately what we're aiming for. Locally, I think one of the challenges that we found was the venture capital ecosystem maybe has 10, 15 years if you really want to extend it. And has been not exclusively, but predominantly focused on asset-light kind of fintech, e-commerce, Mercado Livre, no bank, et cetera. And I think that creates a perception, and maybe to Ben's presentation earlier, perhaps a false perception about what are some of the drawbacks of investing in climate, right? Climate often means more deep tech style investments, but if everyone gets a chance to read the report on Monday, you actually find that deep tech returns beat non-deep tech returns on average. So I think there are a couple of things in terms of timeline, in terms of intensity of science. In our case, for the majority of the life of the company, we had more PhDs than we had engineers, software engineers. So I think that's also a different approach. But I think it's slowly picking up, and Valor was a great example of that, where they kind of stuck their flag in the ground 2 years ago and said, we're going to make climate a big thing for us, and I think other funds will follow.
For years, the venture industry's always felt that climate's too capital intensive, right? That was always one of the roadblocks. But to your point, Marc, many funds want to put more capital to work, so there's this funny tension there, right? Maybe we're finally swinging towards the capital intensive as an interesting opportunity. Let's see, Chris, tell us about spending time on the ground. You spent some time. You said that was really important to understanding the opportunity and the challenges. Talk more about that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So a bit of background. I was working at Google at the time, and I had a front row seat to some of the tensions in the early US-China decoupling, we'll call it, as it was happening in Silicon Valley. How that was impacting our scaled public companies, how it was impacting supply chains for robotics, for also 5G infrastructure in emerging markets. There were many vectors at which I could see from that post that we're at the beginning of a multi-decade secular transformation in which will be a new paradigm for the world, which has implications for early stage startups in the United States, the US-Brazilian relationship, and broadly across the Americas. So I decided to leave my post at Google to pursue a Fulbright in Mexico with the expectation that, an assumption that something will fill this void. And I was a researcher at the ITAM University, focused on what are the ways that our trade agreements, being what I would call critical infrastructure for the global economy, and specifically the Americas. We had just come off of a new USMCA NAFTA renegotiation, and I felt that was the sort of warning shot of how the new trade balance might evolve and impact innovation across the Americas. So I was down there doing the Fulbright, working at an early stage venture fund in Mexico City that was investing all across the region, and really got a front row view into some of the competitive advantages of Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and really the strategic imperative for the US private market ecosystem to have people on the ground and to better understand the talent networks, the competitive advantages, the way that some of the incumbent companies operate their motivations, as well as obviously, and I think this is frankly what scares off a lot of investors who might market themselves as global, but ultimately when it comes down to leading a deal for the first time and saying we're putting our brand and equity and LP capital specifically behind this, it's this sort of paranoia of the known unknown. And that can be elements of, well, I don't have 2 decades of relationships in Washington, D.C. to help me better understand, or the equivalent in Brasilia to help me better understand, okay, this is what's written, what's unwritten. And I think that vector exists, whether it's in the actual underwriting exercise, whether it's in the orientation of the public companies who may be customers for these. So I think that has given me a real sort of sensitivity, and when we're doing deals in the region and we don't have a really close pre-existing connection to the company, the problem space, or its early customers, it requires an added level of forensic investigation. And I think that's frankly where the alpha comes from. And so
the local knowledge, the relationships, the expertise. What's missing? So, Julia, you mentioned the venture sector is relatively young compared to the U.S. Now, that's true for just about every country in the world, by the way, other than the U.S. But Duncan, back to you. What's missing in Brazil that you would really like to see to make? You talk about moving faster,
Yeah.
moving capital faster.
I think when I look at like why do certain things work in the US and you trace back, maybe you can trace it back to the origin of Silicon Valley and other things, and you look at how those ecosystems sprung up, and it's both the existing companies that things can spin out of, and then the supportive networks around them, and that's founders, it's organizations that are supportive of entrepreneurship and that kind of thing. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's missing in Brazil. I think in certain places it's where do you accelerate and really lean into it. And so I think about in the US, you think about Silicon Valley and you go back to Fairchild Semiconductor or something, and great engineers spinning out of that. I think there's evidence that could happen in Brazil. It's just where should that happen, and where are those networks that can be built up and be more supportive? And I think what stands out to me is things like agriculture or forestry or pulp and paper or areas where mining, where Brazil is a global powerhouse, just like the U.S. is in semiconductors or something. It's leaning into those and really trying to promote the entrepreneurship, get founders and people that are early in the ecosystem to feel innovative and accept that innovation. And there is a risk to some innovation, but figure out ways to trial that. And I think leaning into that, building those networks is really, really important. I think Julia will speak to this a little bit probably, but I think the other thing here is hard tech is hard. It's a very big cliche for a reason. So some acceptance there, but building supply chains, building the networks where people can work together and have quick manufacturing turnaround times and that kind of thing. I think that's very, very additive to the ecosystem overall, and it can be collaborative between states, governments, and companies in a pretty or low friction way. So I think those kind of things coming together could really put Brazil ahead.
Since Duncan called Julia out, Julia, over to you.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to that because I think oftentimes as well when we think about climate tech or climate investments, we're imagining things that are going to have to be built basically from zero. And I think for us at Terradot, one of our approaches, and maybe just 30 seconds here of what we do, we basically take silicate rocks that are byproducts of quarry operations or mining operations. We spread them on agricultural land and capture carbon permanently in that way. One of the things that we looked at was the climate challenge is so big and we need to solve it so quickly. What already exists that we can take advantage of, right? And I think in our case with enhanced rock weathering, it became very clear in Brazil that agriculture exists in a very sophisticated and scaled way. Mining exists in a very sophisticated and scaled way. How do we use our science and technology to turn that on, right? And so I think often there's this misconception that climate tech, wow, you have to build absolutely everything from scratch, but there are actually a lot of solutions that are a little bit more plug and play.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the lessons for my students is always that don't build everything from scratch. You will fail. There's a lot of good stuff out there. You can leverage technologies and other advantages. Marc, what are your thoughts on what's missing? You like to see? I mean, you talked about the scale challenge. That's certainly one. But what else?
I'm just having all these kind of like 3G flashbacks. So it's like one of the sayings in our room was like innovation is nice, but copying is easier. All these kind of George Apollo flashbacks. And like just diverging a little bit, just trying to see threads and kind of the mind of a very bad chef here. Now we were talking about cost of capital, innovation, hard tech, and I think almost opening up the aperture and not looking at Brazil in isolation, but looking at where it fits within a global ecosystem is quite interesting. So I mentioned Japan a little earlier. The likely winner of the Prime Minister contest in the Diet October 4th is a Columbia graduate. He is, so Japan's about to, they don't elect, but the parliament will determine either the youngest PM in history or the first female PM in history. The PM, Minister Koizumi, was the Minister of the Environment for 5 years. Just think about that. Lower cost of capital base in Japan. Think about that. He's currently the Minister of Agriculture. Think about that. His father was previously the Prime Minister. So I think opening up the aperture is quite important when thinking about how to overcome challenges, recognizing where these connections lie and the opportunity to connect them. Think about that we have a Columbia graduate, assuming he wins, youngest prime minister in history, focused on the environment, focused on agriculture, creating those connections to the opportunities in Brazil, I think will be an unlock. So energy there, as I kind of what's cycling through my mind, inspired in the moment, Bruce, of this panel, maybe we should scratch that itch.
Yeah. So let's go with that a little bit on the policy side. And, policy being downstream from politics, very important in the area we work in. And frankly, going through rapid change everywhere, right? And obviously here in the U.S., we've seen some very big changes. I think sometimes they're, I don't want to say exaggerated because the changes are massive, but the deck just gets reshuffled. I mean, previously wind and solar was the policy support, and now it's going to be nuclear and geothermal and batteries. Okay, that's the hand. Those are cards we're going to be playing for the next couple of years, I suppose. Back to Brazil, policy. What are your thoughts on policy, hope for policy, any thoughts along the way? And the connection to Japanese pending policy is you open up this discussion, so I think that's really interesting.
I have a good connection with the Japanese. Surf your wave there. Our perspective here has been, at Terradot, has been actually that from our work's perspective, policy has mostly been a tailwind. A couple of reasons, right? So trying to connect it here back to Marc, Brazil has the National Plan for Degraded Pasture Land. Biggest investor in that plan, which covers 40 million hectares of degraded land, is JICA, right? The Japanese Development Institution. And we see so many initiatives of these that for us, where our solution is not only carbon removal, but also land generation, we can plug in quite quickly, right? And the ground is fertile. And combined with that, if you think about banks like the Brazilian National Development Bank, a host of vehicles to support climate, agriculture, degraded land, et cetera, right? So I think from our perspective, we have a huge advantage, even as we think about a lower cost of capital for our business at the stage that it is today, sitting in Brazil, than we would elsewhere where we're getting, 20, 30% for being a startup. So I think those are some of the tailwinds. I think the headwinds are the common ones, right? We tailwind perhaps regulated carbon markets, headwind, what will they actually look like, right? How will they be implemented? How does that influence or combine with the tax reform? A number of questions, right? But overall, I think for us, it's been more tailwind than headwind.
Chris, Duncan, thoughts on policy and Brazil and whoever? Let's go for it.
Well, I think it's just a massive opportunity that Brazil is hosting COP. To me, it feels like in the context where the U.S. specifically has gone from being using all of its might to have the IRA be one of the most truly once-in-a-generation market-making exercises as it relates to decarbonizing technology and infrastructure, to now opening up BLM lands again for extraction. I think if you put Brazil in the context of it is home to so much of the competitive advantages globally that move our economy, it is the lungs of the world, and now it is caught and mired in some ways in this fight with the U.S. as a byproduct of the Bolsonaro relationship. And I think all of that, in my mind, if I'm just writing the great story of the next 5 years, puts Brazil in such a unique position to reframe and recalibrate what is the next 5 to 10 years of leadership going to look like from a global geopolitical perspective. And that isn't a specific regulatory tactic or bill or anything, but it's more at the level of grand narratives. And I think there's a lot of white space for Brazil to play.
The one I'd add is go the opposite direction from Japan and go across the Atlantic to the EU and kind of what's happening with the carbon border adjustment mechanisms and a lot of how that's affecting global commodity trade and where that can go in the long term. And I find it a really interesting intersection of Brazil sitting central to finance from Asia, actually having the commodities and the raw materials and then trading them onward. And at the same time, Brazil's uniquely advantaged in these carbon resources and other ones that we talk about. This is one that at Lowercarbon, we've spent a lot of time thinking about working cross-collaboratively with folks in the EU, and I wish a little bit more with folks in the US on this point, but I think this is one of those, in the world of tariffs and global trade shifts, is one of the main policy tailwinds that we're watching closely.
So I want to ask one last business question, then I want to wrap up with sort of a more personal career-oriented question for many people in the audience, many students especially. The last business one is let's flip the narrative from Brazil looking out. So for Brazilian businesses, Brazilian industry, particularly anything to do with climate, what's their opportunity to either sell internationally or invest internationally? What's their competitive advantage? Where do you see that from that side of it? And I'm going to just open up the question. Who would like to go first on that one? Don't hold back. Marc, I can see the gears turning there, Marc.
Yeah,
what do you think?
I mean, it's so sector specific, right? So, and that's why I think climate investing is so much fun, right? I mean, applying a prism to deploy capital through a climate lens, like, how wonderful is that, right? You know, tech investing 30 years ago, nobody asked you, hey, are you focused on enterprise SaaS, hardware? No, you could do anything. Being a climate investor today has echoes of that. But then we have to subsectorize. So specifically, Bruce, to your question, a sector that, you know, is interesting and fraught is sugarcane ethanol, right? Polyethylene, styrene cracking of a feedstock that's sugarcane. So companies like Allbirds use, you know, their sugar sole. That's an exported good from Brazil in many shoes. That's a great opportunity. It's an asset that's burrowed within Braskem, which has its own noise, if anyone's familiar with that. So I think that is quite interesting. I think obviously the broader nature-based removals carbon credit market is a, you know, where everyone was excited on the demand curve 2 years ago, 3 years ago. The supply seems to be very much available, but to organize that I think is interesting. I think there is green bank financing opportunities that is also a potential in Brazil. There are data center greening opportunities. Where's the supply coming from? We, you know, bought and built an asset called eVolts, which was an electricity transmission play that worked well. So I think kind of as you sectorize it, it's everywhere. It is everywhere. Putting on the lens of climate allocation is what hopefully enables it. So I don't think the opportunity set is lacking. The enablement and how we, as capital allocators, put on our lenses to do it is what will take it to the next level, hopefully.
I couldn't agree more about the, although I've never heard the analogy to tech back 30 years ago, but the reason why I teach in this sector and why it's so exciting is because the opportunity is so broad. And you get to.
By the way, I just for the record, I don't know if there's students here, there are a non-trivial amount of members of my team that we've built over the past 5 years that have come from Bruce's class.
Let's keep it up, Marc. Let's keep it up.
So you deserve some hype too.
Thank you. Julia, were you about to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think you mentioned, you know, what Brazil to the rest of the world. There's a phrase that actually at one of our projects, and we have one of our Corey partners here actually, one of the directors of Embrapa said, which I think for me was a phrase that stuck with me in terms of Brazil's geopolitical role and what can it export to the rest of the world. In the 1970s, Brazil transformed because of the widespread use of liming. So Embrapa spearheaded this research to turn Brazil from an agricultural importer to an exporter. Today is one of the largest exporters in the world across most categories. And this director of Embrapa, he kind of looked at, we work with him, and he looked at us and he said, we've already done this before. We've already spread a bunch of rock on land. We're just changing the rock. And in changing the rock, what else are you exporting, right? And in our case, we hope it'll be carbon. But I think there's already a lot of stories of success stories in Brazil that try and think about what is the analogy for climate, picking up on what Marc said.
So we just have a couple minutes left, and I want to wrap up with a question for all of you. You all have incredible careers. And if you could share some advice with the audience in terms of how you think about your career and opportunities to move into this sector, how would you position yourself, whether you're just graduating now from Columbia or later stage in your career? Any advice whatsoever. It could be a small anecdote or bigger thought. And whoever would like to start us off on that, I'll leave that one open. Chris?
I'm happy to start. Just two things that come to mind. First is you never get what you don't ask for. And I think just being in this community, a part of this conference, affiliated with the university, I think your access is limited by your inquiry. And whether you're a first year, don't know what you want to study yet, or you're in your second year at the MBA and are narrowing in on 2 or 3 specific roles, I think the power of loose ties has been the fuel of my basically every transition point in my career. I think that's the biggest thing. And the second is don't be afraid to leave a really good thing to pursue curiosity, which was ultimately me departing a job that I was frankly underqualified for at Google to pursue an unpaid State Department stipend adventure in Mexico that I didn't know where it would lead. So I think those are my 2 lessons.
It's terrific lessons.
Yeah, I'd build on the point around curiosity, and I think where that goes to a lot of things we see in the early stage venture capital space is curiosity then leads to obsession. And it's following those pieces that you find curious and then leaning in on them and building that obsession to the point where it's the only thing you can think about, and you have to go build that thing in the world. And I think it's to some extent what allows Julia and many other founders and entrepreneurs to build these companies that are it's really hard to bring this fresh new thing into the world. And so that's always served me well in my career. I think amongst our team, amongst the founders we back, it's leaning in on those places that just are very self-resonating. So.
Julia, thoughts as an entrepreneur and advice there?
I was just actually going to put on my patriotic hat and say, if you haven't been to Brazil, go. And if you are Brazilian, go back.
Marc, that's a tough to follow.
Carnival's amazing, by the way. It's so good. Look, kind of first principles, right? I mean, I never thought I was going to be an investor, right? I thought I was going to be a theologian, so maybe that's why I belong in climate. But I just kind of echo what everyone on the panel said, follow your passion, follow your curiosity, have an open mind. For me, helping lead a climate fund allows me to talk to my kids about my job, which is truly a gift I don't take for granted. To bring it back to 3G, we had these, principles on the door kind of thing. And I won't bring up zero-based budgeting, but One of them, is, if you don't know, ask, is a kind of parable, like the Hillel parable. But then, like, if you do know, teach. And I think within climate, like, this is a great forum, right? This is a institution of learning, and Bruce is teaching, so it's okay, akin to being a tech investor 30 years ago, to proselytize a little bit, right? Like, don't be afraid to say there's huge opportunity here. Let's invoke a little magnetism and polarity. So summits like this, I think, have that effect. And if you can take anything away, it's, don't be shy, exercise curiosity, pull people in. And because there will be commercial outcomes, there will be impactful outcomes, there'll be mission-driven outcomes. And hopefully, we can all talk to our kids about it.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Julia. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Bruce.